Okay, so we spoke earlier about defining functions. Now let's talk a little bit about calling functions. So you call a function by specifying the name, followed by any arguments to the function embedded within parentheses. So, for example, we've got this function called distance. It takes in 2 points as tuples. When it's time to call the function, we say the name of the function, and then inside parentheses, we pass in 2 points as tuples. Now, how's Python going to figure out which of our arguments goes to which variable inside the function? We do this with argument matching. And there are a number of different ways to do this in Python. So you can pass arguments by name or with default values, and you can use collectors for extra arguments too. Let's look at some examples. Let's start with the default. By default, arguments are matched by position in Python from left to right. And you have to pass exactly as many arguments as there are argument names, otherwise known as parameters, in the function header. So here's an example of that. We've got this function. It takes in A, B, and C. And we have to pass in those exact 3 things, and it's going to print them in order. Now, suppose that I were to try to pass in fewer than 3. I'm going to get a type error. It says that func is missing a required positional argument. So we have to pass in exactly as many things as this function is asking for in its arguments. Now that doesn't have to be the case. Python allows for default arguments, and that allows you to specify when you write the function the value that you want there to be if somebody doesn't pass in something for that particular parameter. So that means that whoever's calling is no longer required to specify that value. Let's look at this example. Func, we got A. A you still got to pass in, but B has a default value of 1, and C has a default value of spam. So when we call func33, it's going to say 33, then 1, then spam, invoking these 2 default values. If we pass in 33 and then 23, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to do 33, then 23, and then spam, invoking the default value here while using the positional argument that was passed in here. Now it's worth noting before we move on that if you were to try to call func with no arguments, you would still be told that you were missing a required positional argument because A doesn't have a default value. So you do have to pass in anywhere where there's a required positional argument a value. Now, let's talk about the order that these parameters need to appear. When you're defining a function, you have to place default arguments. After non-default arguments or required arguments. The reason for this is because it would make it very difficult for the method to figure out which arguments you had provided values for if you had the required ones and the not required ones with default values intermixed. So this is going to give us non-default argument follows a default argument. Because you can see here that if somebody passed in func 3323, the 33 is probably A, but is the 23 supposed to be C? Or is the 23 supposed to be B where spam is the default? It's hard to tell. So we just don't allow it. Now, there is a way that we can get around this concern about the order, which is to provide arguments by keyword. Positional arguments are matched from left to right, as we discussed, but keywords are matched by the argument name. Now, you can mix keywords, just like we've done here. So, for example, with this function, we can call it with all positional arguments like so. Or we can call with just two positional arguments and use one of the default values. Or we can call just one of the positional arguments and use both default values. Now here's where it gets interesting. We can also assign a value to an argument by using keyword argument syntax. So here, we print out Bob, Sally, and Joe. Now these arguments, once we're using keywords, they don't have to be in order anymore. You see we have B at the beginning now, C, and then A. And Python's going to interpret this with Bob at the beginning, and then Sally, and then Joe, because those are the names of the arguments that we call up here. And as we saw before, you still can't pass in nothing because we have the required positional argument in A. Okay, so it's worth noting as well that you have to specify a value for all arguments that do have a default via a mixture of positional or keyword arguments. So, suppose that we try to call this. What's happening here is that the B default value is still being used, 1, because even though this is the second positional argument, it has the keyword C, which is a third argument in our signature. Now let's take a look at this as well. Suppose that we're wanting to call the function and we've assigned a value for B and we've assigned a value for C. We're going to get an error because we don't have a value for A, and A doesn't have a default, which means it's still a required argument. All right, now let's talk about collecting keyword arguments. Python also allows functions to collect however many positional or keyword arguments you want. Now you'll see these in functions preceded by 1 or 2 asterisks. And these arguments are collected into a tuple, an immutable collection. So let's take an example. We've got our reduce add function here. What this does is it takes in any number of objects and then it adds them all together. So we can pass in 3 items, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? Or we can pass in more than 3 items. We can pass in as many as we want to. Now, you'll notice that we could, the way that you'll sometimes see this done, particularly by beginner programmers, is rather than include this asterisk, they'll make args a list. Like so. Now, you can do this, but you don't need to. You don't have to make this a collection object. You don't have to make this another tuple or a list or a collection or any of those things. Whoops, extra paren. You can just pass the arguments in directly, no extra parentheses, no collection, by doing this. One other nice thing about this is that you can also pass in just one item like so. Okay. Now let's talk about collecting keyword arguments. Using the double asterisk allows callers to pass key value pairs as individual keywords. And then those are collected as a dictionary, of course, because that's how we store keys and values in Python. Suppose we're trying to make a dictionary, and we have one arg with a default value of Bob, and then asterisk kwargs. So what it's going to do is it's going to print out our kwargs, and then for each key value pair in there, it's going to print that the key is a given value. Let's take a look at what this is going to do. So now we're passing in name equals John, course equals Python, age equals 25. These are our kwargs, and then we print out each argument in there. Now it's worth noting that we have arg here as well. And when we pass in arg as a different value than the default, that still doesn't get included in our kwargs. That's still its own argument. Also the case when we pass it positionally. Now let's talk a little bit about unpacking arguments. Callers can also use an iterable to pass all the objects in an iterable object as individual positional arguments. We'll look at an example of that in a second. Or they can use double asterisk on a dictionary to pass all key value pairs in a dictionary as individual keyword arguments. Now here's what that means. Suppose we've got this double function that returns a tuple of 3 separate things doubled. And we can call, and we have this point object, right? A tuple of 3 values. What if we want to pass in those 3 values as the values right here? We can't pass in the point by itself because it's a tuple, which is only going to be one value. But we can split them out using an asterisk like this. This is called splatting in the Ruby programming language. So it passed in each of these as individual things. Whereas if we don't do this, it's going to say we're missing 2 required positional arguments because we don't have the asterisk, and so it's interpreting this whole tuple as the first argument. So we use the asterisk. We can do the same thing with a list. It doesn't have to be a tuple. Now it's worth noting that if we pass in too many arguments like this, we're still going to get an error. Let's call it so you can see that. Takes 3 positional arguments before we're given. Now, suppose we wanted to pass in keyword arguments. We've got a dictionary here that defines X, Y, and Z as 0, 3, and 4. We pass those in with the double asterisk, which passes each of these key value pairs as their keyword for the given function's arguments. Now, let's take a look at how this functions. This point is very similar to this point, except that this one has a keyword of X and this one has a keyword of T. When we try to use this one as our double asterisk input, it says double got an unexpected keyword argument of T. It doesn't recognize that one because that's not one of the argument names. And if we were to try it with this dictionary with this extra argument for P, we would get an error as well. You can see the full rules for argument matching summarized inside of this table from Learning Python. But you can also see the argument matching summary in the documentation for Python itself.